For those of you who don't know, I became a fan of classic horror films at a young age, primarily the classic horror films released by Universal Pictures during the 1930s and 1940s. This will be the first in a series of videos where I will be breaking down the home video releases of many of those films and going into detail on the varying significance of each release. We will mostly be focusing on the films released during the 1930s and 1940s. For today's video, we will be focusing on the films that Universal released as part of their Dracula franchise. To help keep the discussion a little more condensed, I will not be going into detail in this video about the later crossover films. They will be featured in a later video. Also, for the sake of discussion, the bulk of these videos will be comparing the VHS, DVD, and Blu-ray releases, with minimal mention of other releases when necessary. Also, for the sake of discussion, these videos will only be comparing the video releases in the US and Canada. So let's get this discussion going by beginning with one of the most influential and iconic vampire films of all time, Dracula, produced by Universal Pictures in 1931, directed by Todd Browning and starring Bela Lugosi. We'll begin with the VHS releases. Dracula was first released to VHS by MCA Videocassette in 1980. This same edition was repackaged a few years later by MCA Home Video. This cover was a little more appealing to look at as the image of Lugosi was fitted to the cover, unlike the previous cover which had the same image in a smaller square. One thing to note about this release is that it featured Dracula's censored audio track. Because of this, it did not feature Renfield screaming when Dracula strangles him, or Dracula groaning when he is staked by Van Helsing. Dracula's next VHS release came in 1991 when the film was included in MCA Universal's Universal Monsters Classic Collection VHS series. This was my introduction to the Universal Monsters franchise. It was also this VHS release that introduced Dracula's restored audio track, so the aforementioned bits that were missing before were present here. In 1999, Universal decided to re-release many of their classic horror films on video once again, this time as a tie-in to the release of their remake of The Mummy. Yeah, the one with Brendan Fraser. For these releases, it would mark the final time that the Universal Monster films would be released on VHS, as well as the first time that they would be released on DVD. Dracula would have the distinction of having two final VHS releases in 1999. The first featured the restored film that was on the 1991 VHS, while the other featured the film with a brand new score by composer Philip Glass. The edition with the Glass score had two variations in packaging. One was a standard slipcase, just like the edition with the unaltered film, while the other was a mini clamshell. Of the two variations, the one with the mini clamshell was the one I had. What was unfortunate, however, was I wasn't even aware that the edition had a different score until I popped the tape in for the first time. I don't think I ever made it 5 minutes into the movie while playing that score. I frankly just could not stand that new music. The score practically dominated 99% of the film. There was even scenes that didn't need music, and yet there was music playing. Even worse, there were scenes where the music even seemed to be overshadowing the dialogue in some spots. This score really seemed to be calling attention to itself. Sorry, Philip Glass, but this score did not make the cut. Next, we'll talk about the VHS releases of the next three Dracula films, the Spanish adaptation produced at the same time as the Lugosi film, Dracula's Daughter produced in 1936, and Son of Dracula produced in 1943. The only VHS release of the Spanish version came in 1992 when the film was included in Universal Monsters Classic Collection. Also included was an interview with actress Lupita Tovar, a feature that would later be carried over to the DVD release. English subtitles were provided for this release. Because the film had been considered lost for many years, subtle changes were added throughout the film to help re-copyright the film again. This included adding various musical cues throughout the film, such as redoing the Swan Lake theme during the opening credits, as well as adding musical cues when Dracula exits his coffin. Additionally, a 1992 copyright tag was added during the opening credits. Dracula's Daughter would also make its VHS debut in the Universal Monsters Classic Collection, and was repackaged a few years later with more or less the same cover. Son of Dracula made its VHS debut in the late 1980s by MCA Home Video and was later included in the Universal Monsters Classic Collection in 1991. It's interesting to note that while the original VHS release featured the correct music recording that accompanied the opening Universal Globe, the 1991 VHS, for unknown reasons, features a different recording of the same music. This was later corrected on the DVD and Blu-ray editions. And now on to the DVD releases. The original DVD release of the first Dracula film came out in 1999 and featured both the Lugosi original and the Spanish adaptation. It also provided viewers with the option of selecting between the film's original unscored mono or the Philip Glass score. It also had a pretty decent selection of extras considering the time of its release. Something to note, however, for some reason at the end of the opera scene, right after Dracula says, "There are far worse things awaiting men than death," the musical cue that follows this and concludes the scene is for some reason missing on the DVD. Even more bizarre is that the cue still appears on the VHS release that had the same cover as the DVD. How does that work? This same DVD would be repackaged a few times in later years, including this 2012 4-pack DVD set and this solo release from 2014. 2 years later, Dracula's Daughter and Son of Dracula would get their DVD debut as a double feature disc, with very little other than trailers being the main extras. Something to note when comparing the DVD version of Dracula's Daughter to the VHS version is that the opening credits sequence in both is a little different. The credits appear in a slightly different order, and also the DVD gives an on-screen story credit to John L. Balderston, while the VHS version does not. The version with the Balderston credit will be continued through subsequent releases. Additionally, the DVD version of Son of Dracula concluded with an advertisement for war bonds, something that was dropped on the Blu-ray release in later years. In 2004, to tie in with the release of the film Van Helsing, Universal again decided to re-release their classic horror films on DVD and introduced the Universal Monster Legacy Collections. This was the first time that the Universal Monster films were provided in multi-film DVD sets. The Dracula set included not only the original film, but also the Spanish adaptation, Dracula's Daughter, Son of Dracula, and the later crossover film House of Dracula, with the bulk of the extras from the earlier releases carried over. The release used more or less the same transfers as the earlier DVD releases, though for some reason the audio track for the original film appears to have been changed. Actually, even worse, they reverted back to the censored audio track. That's right, the version of Dracula in the 2004 DVD set has the censored audio track that cuts out Renfield's death screams and Dracula's death groans. What happened? The overall quality of the track doesn't appear to be that good either. It's a little too fuzzy and garbled for my tastes. But hey, maybe they'll get it right on the next release. Well, sorta. In 2006, to commemorate the film's 75th anniversary, Universal issued a 2-disc DVD set of Dracula. This set did not include the additional films other than the Spanish adaptation. Both versions were given new remastered transfers, and it was also the first video release of the Spanish version to have the original unaltered mono track without the 1992 editions, although the 1992 copyright tag did remain. The audio track for the Lugosi film reverts back to the restored version, although it still appears to be based around the same garbled and fuzzy mix that was used on the 2004 DVD. Additionally, the 1997 to 2012 Universal logo is plastered at the start of the film. Most of the extras from the earlier releases were carried over here, while new features were also added, notably the 1998 documentary Universal Horror. Which brings us to 2012 and the debut of the Universal Monsters on Blu-ray. This was part of Universal's then campaign in honor of their 100th anniversary. Dracula and the Spanish version would be among the films restored and remastered in HD and would be included in this set, the Classic Monsters Essentials Collection. Overall, both films were given excellent treatment in their restoration of Blu-ray, both with visuals and audio. It definitely is the best that they've looked on home video, and probably the best that they're ever going to look between now and the foreseeable future. And yes, for those curious, the issues that plague the audio of the original film on the last few releases does not appear here, and there is also no logo plastering. The Dracula Blu-ray would also be re-released separately over the next few years with different covers, and would also appear in the 2017 Dracula Legacy Blu-ray set, but more on that later. In 2014, the Universal Monster films were again re-released as Legacy DVD sets, which this time included the Abbott and Costello crossover films, and also were printed on single-sided DVD 9 discs instead of the problematic DVD 18 discs of the 2004 releases. These sets were available both individually and collectively in a 30-film box set. The Dracula set included the same films as the 2004 DVD set, but also included the crossover films House of Frankenstein and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Additionally, the DVDs for Dracula, the Spanish Dracula, and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein come from the 2012 Blu-ray masters, while the remaining films use the older DVD masters. The format of the 2014 DVD Legacy sets would later be continued with the subsequent Legacy Blu-ray sets, with a Dracula set coming out in 2017 and later included in the 30-film box set released in 2018. As I mentioned earlier, the 2012 Blu-ray disc of Dracula with both the Lugosi and Spanish versions of the film was included in this set, as well as the 2012 Blu-ray disc of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. The discs with the remaining films feature brand new restored in HD versions of those films made for the release. Well, that's about all I have to add for this video. I hope you will stay tuned throughout the month of October for more insights to these films and their varying video releases. Until then, have a spooktacular day.